For those of you who don't know me, I am Gabriela Baez-Aventura, Dr. Gabriela Baez-Aventura, professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies and Deputy Director at Arte Público Press, and co-director of the US Latino Digital Humanities Center at the University of Houston. On behalf of Arte Público, Recovering the US Hispanic Literary Heritage program, and usLdh, we welcome you to this talk, and now I'll let my colleagues take over from now. We can't hear you, Caro.
Ready? Now? Okay, good morning. I'm Dr. Carolina Villarroel. I'm Brown Foundation Director of Research at the Recovery Program. As many as you know, APP and Recovery, two important forces in the field of U.S. Latino studies, were founded by Dr. Nicolas Canelos, recent recipient of the National Medal for the Humanities. His vision to establish the nonprofit press and the historical archival program stemmed from a social justice need to document the legacy of Latino culture, language, and literature in the United States. To date, Arte Público Press has published over 700 books, fiction, nonfiction, including young adults and children's literature, and Recovery has located over 1,500 newspapers and digitized thousands of records that document the presence of Latinx people in the land that we know as the United States. The social justice need continues to this day as we fight against the erasure of our bodies and language on a daily basis. Therefore, the need to create a center that could use these resources for digital scholarship was and is imminent. My colleague, Dr. Gabriela Baez-Aventura, and I began the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Center 7 years ago with the generous support from the Mellon Foundation, and we're happy to report that we have made important strides in this field. We have grown our team to include Dr. Lorena Gautreaux as Digital Programs Manager. Together, we organize talks and workshops on DH and social justice, present at conferences across the U.S., train and mentor students and faculty from all academic levels, as well as community members on U.S. Latino DH praxis, create digital projects and datasets. We have awarded over 25 grants in aid for U.S. Latino digital humanities projects and training, and this has solidified our usLdh mission to continue working and supporting research on the U.S. Latino reading legacy. We invite you to visit our website, artepublicopress.com, for more information, to follow us on social media, and to use the hashtag usLdh, the H, to share information on our lectures and about U.S. Latino DH. Welcome, Brandon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Lorena Gautreaux, and before I introduce Brandon Walsh, I'd like to go over a few logistics. So please use our chat functions to type in your questions or comments. And Brandon will do his presentation and then lead the workshop. And so he'll be able to open it up for questions when that's appropriate. And we'll either, I guess, depending on how it goes, Brandon, and you can guide this, whether they should unmute themselves or if you want me to read the questions, that's fine. And all right, so I'm going to go ahead and do the introduction. Brandon Walsh is head of students programs in the Scholars Lab in the University of Virginia Library. Prior to that, he was visiting assistant professor of English and Mellon Digital Humanities Fellow in the Washington and Lee University Library. He received his PhD and MA from the Department of English at the University of Virginia, where he has also held fellowships in the Scholars Lab and acted as project manager of NINES. His primary research focuses on digital humanities pedagogy, looking at the ways it can reflect and enact infrastructural change in higher education. He serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy. He was a regular instructor at Hilt and has work published or forthcoming with Programming Historian. Insights, the Digital Library Pedagogy Cookbook, Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, and Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, among others. So help me welcome Dr. Brandon Walsh. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, all three of you, so much. I mean, I hope you, for that really generous and sweet introduction, I hope you all know how much I admire you. The feeling is very much mutual. I mean, I think I was there at Hilt when you got the email about the Mellon initial Mellon grant, and it's just truly has been amazing to see you all cultivate this community that was already there and just continuing to grow it. I write about you and cite you and refer to you all the time. So truly is an honor to join you all. My AirPods just died moments ago. So if you have trouble hearing me, let me know, and I'll let you know if I have trouble hearing you. One request I have is if we could pause the recording at a certain point, Lorena, if that's possible, just because there's a point at which I share a series of DMs from our former director of information policy, who's a copyright lawyer. And I think as a lawyer, he would not want me to put his opinions out there. I thought about this like 10 minutes ago, that he would probably not want me to do that. So I'll share that information with you, and then I'll try and probably summarize it for a different version of the slides or something like that. But just for his own, like, so his skin doesn't crawl by proxy, as a chill doesn't go up his spine when we get there. And I really did, hopefully you will see that this is, I'm going to attempt to make this a bit of a workshop. It's kind of, I mean, there's a lot of information to share with you, but hopefully, so I'm going to ask you to talk pretty quickly, pretty much right away. And so please do unmute if you would, but also feel free to use the chat. And Lorena, like you were saying a second ago, I trust you to make good judgments about how to manage that. But just in terms of some housekeeping things, so you should all hopefully see my slides, right? You can see things. So this is me killing a little bit of time in case you wanted to go to this URL there. So I have here a ton of information, almost certainly more stuff than we can go through in an hour and a half. So if you go to this link at the bottom there, you should be able to see the slide deck as it is, and you should be able to download it. So so I'm going to keep my slides up until we get to the third part, the graph section, when we start playing with Voyant tools. But at that time, I'm going to pivot over and start clicking around on the interface. But if it's helpful to have some of the actual direct information about what to click when, you can go there. I also have a separate laptop up just for that purpose for myself. So, please just be mindful. Oh yeah, thank you, Lorena, for sharing that. But if you have any accessibility needs also, that can be sort of useful to grab the slides. So just by way of setting the agenda for you all, we're going to go through 3 phases. And so in a certain way, when Lorena and Carolina and Gabby emailed, I believe the framing was sort of more about Voyant tools, and I sort of immediately kind of tried to pivot things a little bit, because I always find that there's a series of things that I wish people already knew or already talked about with me before they even get to the part of analyzing stuff. And that's kind of the structure that I put together for this workshop, which is to say, we're going to talk about how to go from a book to a number to actually doing analysis on the stuff. And so similarly, some of the materials that we're going to talk about in the first 2/3 are things that I put together for a series of workshops at UVA, where I was basically like, these are all the things that I wish you knew before you came to talk to me, because it's almost always the case that people have issues or problems that they need to try and think about before we even get to the point of trying to do text analysis, of trying to put something in Voyant. So hopefully you're going to come away with a better sense of how to get started analyzing this stuff, but also just like what makes a research question, how to get there, how to get your materials in an accessible form. So it's going to be a mix of discussion, mix of information sharing, and a mix of playing. I'm going to almost certainly have more stuff than we can get through. So I have some alarms set just to sort of make sure that I roughly get through the pieces and that we don't like leave Voyant off entirely and Lorena and Gabby and Carolina leave very angry at me. So by way of getting started, I wanted to start by just asking you, what is a book? And I have a class this semester that is about data literacy, and all of my students are STEM, science and engineering folks. And when I ask them things like this, they look at me like I'm out of my mind. So please, if you would, I have gone to my wife's bookcases behind me. I have pulled a book off. What is it? What am I, like, what is a book? So please do unmute or drop things in the chat.
How do you want this to work? It's a compilation.
Sure. A compilation of what?
Ideas.
Yeah. Good. Gerardo?
Yeah, I think a book is also an archive.
Yeah.
An archive of, ideas, stories, images, formulas, different kinds of things.
Good. Yeah. And a couple things in the chat: a printed and bound set of information, a bound series of pages that have content. Yeah, those are all really good answers. Anything else that hasn't been covered? Pages of text bound together to create a record. Yep. I have this thing in my hand. It is a bunch of pages. It is put together. It's an artifact. It collects history. Yeah, Karen, very gratefully already complicating things. That's great. Yeah, anything else? Does anyone else have anything? An escape? Do you want to expand on that, Gabby? I think that might actually get to a little bit of what I'm fishing for.
Yeah, I think it's like an escape from reality, an escape from anything, like a pathway into another world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very good. So I think you're already pointing to some of the complications, some of the things that are confusing, and some of the things that are going to really challenge some of the stuff we're talking about. It is both a physical thing, it is a record of particular materials, and it's also in a certain way the way that we understand it, and sort of information that's maybe not in the particular text itself, but something that we bring to it. So this particular book, Texts from Jane Eyre, I have never read. I was just reading the blurb and I want to go to see what it is. But it's a series of imagined text message conversations with various authors. So, it is both the text on the page, but it also relies on a lot of outside information that you as a reader have to even get something out of it. So here I'm sort of pointing towards a book has an author, a book has all these sort of connections into the outside world that help us make sense of it. Is it a book just because you put it on your bookshelf? Yeah, I love this. This is great. Y'all are already way more talkative than my STEM students. Maybe should have told you to pause the recording. They're great. I love them in their own way, but they're also very confused by me. So another question is, what is a text? Distinct from the actual physical book. Form of communication, good. What else? Is a wordless picture book text? I'm already causing you all to have an existential crisis. It's great. Data, Gabby is a plant in the audience. Good. What else? I guess even in a more concrete sense, what is the data in a book? A set of words.
Information that's captured. I don't want to say on a page because their texts are not paper, right? They're tied to that, but it doesn't have to be letters because it could be images or something that tries to give communicate meaning.
Yeah, very, very good. My colleague Shane, who was a PhD student in history, was doing he's got a computer science background. He would go on a long tangent here, I think, about Claude Shannon and entropy and what qualifies as communication and stuff. But in this case, what I was looking at was a lot of what's coming through in the chat: words, punctuation, articulated expression using some sort of symbols. So in this case, on the right, I have a series of text characters, including spaces, including line breaks, and that sort of thing. So this is where my STEM students really look at me like I've lost it. What is a book not? And what is a text not? And you all are doing great, so feel free to, rise above any feelings of confusion and just shout out what comes to mind. Not a blog post, not a single poem. Yeah, so we have certain cultural associations with the kinds of things. So a book depends on being open to interpretation. A book is not random. That I think is important for what we're talking about. It's like there's a certain way in which this, can I go back? Yes, this text is a text because these characters, these are words are in a particular sequence, right? They are in an order. And I have a term for that in a little bit. Good, what else?
There's some undetermined length, right? Like you said, one poem is not a book. But that's weird because there are some that are really short, you know. I don't know what the number is.
Poem, it's one poem.
Well,
And it's a book.
Bound in a book. That's true, a long poem. Epic poem.
Poem, Iliad, yes. That I kind of was thinking.
Yeah. And I think importantly, there's some sort of, to go back to Gabby's sort of reference towards the reader and the way the reader interacts with the book and the text. There's some sense in which, yes, it is true that like the Iliad is one poem. It is, we might consider it one thing, but you know, I'm almost certain my wife has some sort of anthology of literature back there that probably has the Iliad contained in a larger bound text with other texts in it. So it can sort of get very confusing, especially when we are talking about a computer, which is really the whole point of this. So when I work with students, these slides and this beginning of the workshop is really geared towards the student who says, I want to do text analysis. And I say, cool, do you have your text? And they say, yeah. And then they bring in a stack of books and I say, oh no, we need to talk more about what I mean by do you have your texts? Which is why I have this image on the right. This is not a book, because I think the first thing to keep in mind is just that the format of your materials matters an awful lot. So for the purposes of like setting up a text analysis project, the first thing that I always want to do and want to think about is, what do I actually have with me? Do I have a stack of books? Do I have a series of images, series of PDF images? Do I actually have a file in which I have characters in a particular sequence? And then I think what we're going to talk about in a second is that the computer is very literal. And for the purposes of what we're talking about, not just like the medium, the format of the material matters a lot, but also every single element of that matters a lot. So the computer can't infer connections between things. As far as it's concerned, the with a capital T and the with a lowercase t are entirely different words. They have a capital T and a lowercase t. Like the characters actually physically don't connect. And you know, obviously as readers, we know that this isn't true. And we know that there are ways in which they're connected, and we can tell a computer how to relate those two things. But these kinds of like basic assumptions, I think, about how concrete we need to be at a base level with computers when we're doing this stuff, I think is a really good first step for figuring out how to form really complicated research questions, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But then also, to go back to Gabby's escapist approach to reading, the computer is not going to know necessarily anything about a text by default unless we connect these things for it. So to go back to this text, the computer has no idea what is contained in this text. It doesn't know who wrote it, what it came from, when it came from. It's just an image. And depending on the work that I've done with this image, it may or may not actually know that there are characters in it, which we'll talk about a little more in a second. So this is all by way of saying that the first step is really to disambiguate what it is you're thinking about and what it is you have access to. And so I was going to show you just a few examples of corpora, like text analysis projects that I've set up just to show you how I go about organizing things and how thinking about these things in certain terms can help to, I think, solve a lot of problems when you're starting out. And they're the kind of things that I wished folks came to us with. So I already talked about, it's not a text is what we care about. We care about the sequence of characters. We're not talking about a printed book, a photo, a PDF. So in general, the ultimate goal for my students, my collaborators, is I want to get them to a set of plain text versions of their documents, and then the kinds of metadata categories like who wrote each text, what date they were published, any other kinds of things we're interested in, like the gender of the authors, publishing information. that kind of stuff is often, if it's not actually in the sequence of characters, you have to add it separately. So I'll show you examples of what this looks like in a minute, but often for me, I have a corpus folder that has many different texts in it, and then I have an associated metadata file that contains information about those texts. And I also I'm really aware of the community that I am talking to and how you're often interested in working in languages primarily that aren't in English. So I'm going to try and touch down on these kinds of issues as they are relevant to text analysis more broadly, and also as they are relevant to literature in Spanish, especially, but also just in other kinds of languages. So this is the first of those things, which is to say that if you're working with files in your computer, you can put diacritical markings in your file names, but that might cause issues depending on what your operating system is, like if you're working with Mac computers versus Linux versus Windows. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also, in general, I try to avoid spaces, and I have lower cases in my file names, which might feel exceedingly nitpicky, but actually that kind of stuff matters. So just by way of showing you a few examples of what my projects look like, this is a Virginia Woolf project that I worked on. I was interested in sound recording of Virginia Woolf. And the first thing I did was assemble a series of texts. Here I actually I put the date in the file name just because that was at the time how I thought I was going to track the metadata. Some other examples later. But I have like my documents in a single folder, and then I have the actual analytical files in Python and elsewhere. Here's an example of French newspapers related to a particular scandal in 19th century France, or I guess early 20th century and late 19th century France. But you can see how we're starting to gather both the information about the texts separate from the text themselves. So we have the URLs for each particular article, the files in which we are starting to look at whether or not that URL has been downloaded and we've started cleaning it, who's doing the cleaning, what newspaper it's from, what date it's from. And if you've ever worked with metadata, you'll know that it gets very hairy very quickly. But I think this sort of like preliminary organizational step is very important and can just be helpful to see things. So I'm going to pause just for a second before I dump some more information at you, and then we're going to have a few questions that I want to ask. But does anyone have any questions right now based on what I have said so far?
Actually, yes, I was writing it on the chat, but I'll just go ahead and ask it. I was curious as to how do you determine, for instance, in the Virginia Woolf book, what is a text? Is a text a full chapter, or how do you determine the length? Is it pages or how?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think this often is especially relevant with poetry, because I would get people who have like books of poems, but they're interested not in the book necessarily. They're interested in the actual poems as individual items, but then they also might be interested in stanzas. So I think it really depends on what your research questions are. But once we get to the second section, the piece on words and numbers and how you can measure stuff, I think what I'm going to try and articulate is that at the end of the day, whatever you're interested in, you have to try and find some way to convey it to the computer, like concretely and like measurably. So in this case, if I have the whole file, I also have these chapter markers, chapter 1, and you can presume that there's going to be a chapter 2, a chapter 3, a chapter 4. And I can use those to divide up into the chapters. I can use the line breaks to divide into paragraphs. And then another common function is to divide things into sentences. And there are lots of different complicated ways to do that. But really, the key thing there is that there is a way, like something I can grab onto that'll divide it for me, if that makes sense.
Thank you. It does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay.
I actually have a question. I can't remember what the name of the application I was using, but it was a free app that let me do some text analysis, just basic frequency. And I thought I was able to upload PDFs to that. So I was really surprised to hear you say that not PDFs.
So we're going to talk about this in a second, which is to say that it depends. And it depends a lot on what kinds of PDFs you're looking at. which I think is actually a really good segue. So it's like you are a plant as well. So I'm going to use you as an opportunity to continue just to talk a little bit about like how you actually get your text into the sort of system that you're working with. So like I mentioned, part of the goal really is to get access to like what is inside your materials, whether it's from a printed book, an ebook, the web, figure out the metadata. I also wanted to note here that people working with text often have lots of copyright questions as to what you're allowed to do with it. And I have good news and complicated news for you, which is to say anything you want to share, like your results, is fine. It's fine to do this work if you have access to the text. But there's often a second legal question about how you're actually getting access to those texts, which I'll talk about when we get to that in a second. But the first one, talking about how you get stuff from a print book, I think is exactly what Karen was, or Karen Mary, I think Gabby called you, is about, which is to say, sometimes people come in not with printed books, but with a series of page images, series of PDFs, and they think they're good. And in a certain way, yes, those are electronic things. But what was probably happening behind the scenes when you uploaded those PDFs was something very specific that's useful to know about, which is to say, it was something called optical character recognition. And so so if you ever hear OCR, that's what the term is referring to. And optical character recognition, if you break each of those words down, optical referring to like the eyes or to light, character referring to literally the characters on a page, and then recognition, like some sense of how the blobs of ink or the handwriting connects to the actual like thing that it is. So what was probably happening behind the scenes was you were uploading a PDF and then they were using some software to try and extract the text, actual sequence of characters from those images. And that can be a really vexed process depending on what kind of software you're using, and especially what the quality of your images is. And so I have an example here at the right, just because this was originally from our 19th century class, but also you can see exactly different kinds of text and how this free option that I used was very good in certain things and bad at other things. So you can see it does okay with the first line. These eyes could read and then it starts to get a little confused. John Barrymore, a couple paragraphs down, is like essentially not there at all. And the reason for that is that when you are running an OCR software over something, it is looking at the pixels, right, and the way that they're arranged and comparing that against its own training data of a whole bunch of pixels, so if you look at something and you have what is a good example? Like an O. And okay, actually in the bottom when it says in Sherlock Holmes, you can see on the right in the OCR, it's Sherlock Holmes. But I think that's actually, that looks like a 0 and not an O. So I think, like, how do we know a 0 and an O are distinct from each other? And how do we know that they're not an 8 or a D? Those depend on us having seen a whole lot of Ds and Os and zeros, right? And the computer really depends on the quality of the image. So I think what was happening behind the scenes was probably that. And there's definitely software you can use. You can use some AI tools to extract text, and it just kind of depends on a lot of different variables. So I think just knowing that this is a complicating issue, I think, is a really important step. And sometimes people just assume they have the PDFs and they're good. But a lot of times what you have to do is take the best quality OCR that you can get and then correct it as you go with human eyes, unless it's like really high quality, which is something that we were doing in the 19th century text. Yes, technology has come very far. And you can actually do OCR on your phone, which is like frankly mind-blowing to me. With the new iPhones, or I guess this was new as of like 2 or 3 years ago, you take a photo, there's a button you can press on your photo and it'll extract text for you. I use it for recipes all the time because it's way easier than like typing out the ingredients. Anyway, that's an aside. So this is a quick test. I have these 2 images here. Which one do you think will produce better text, better OCR, if I were to tell my computer to extract the text from them?
Left.
No.
Yeah, so why do you think the left will be better?
The first one?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Because it's more
first
readable.
The
Yeah.
first image that you have there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so when I ran this workshop for some students, I actually shared the resulting text, and what you can see is that the left is almost perfect up until you get about halfway down, and then once the spine starts to curve, it starts to get worse and worse, and then the right one is pretty unintelligible, except for once it gets a little further away from the spine. So that's just to say that it can matter a lot. If you're getting PDFs from like an archive or a library, a lot of times there'll be really flat scans, really high quality that can really produce good text, even if it's not in there already. Which is not to say that like having only access to a printed book is the end of the world. It's more just like these are things to know about, right? So much of what I said so far in terms of a pipeline for getting materials out of texts and working with them is the same, I think, regardless of language. It becomes a lot more complicated once we talk about how to actually access the words in the text themselves. The one notable exception is if you're working with right to left language, and especially some maybe less frequently studied classical languages that rely on different alphabets. So really, I think it's important to do some research ahead of time and figure out how well these tools work with the particular languages that you're working with, because sometimes there are better, more specialized tools. I have a student who's working with Punjabi right now, and the typical pipeline with the free tools is not necessarily going to work for her, but there are other people who have shared resources that are just worth knowing about. So I'm going to breeze very quickly through some of this and then move on just to get to the further materials. But just to briefly summarize, you can also get materials from ebooks, from websites, from the Hathi Trust, and I have some notes here about places that you might want to go to look at seeing if your texts are even available or are out there. Places like the Hathi Trust and other kinds of academic groups are likely to have already sorted out copyright questions. But really, I think the biggest copyright question, even separate from a legal one, is if you have an ebook version of your text, it's often not just legally complicated to get access to it, but can be very technically complicated too. It used to be possible to pull text out of an ebook, and then I think that has proven to be less and less possible. It's actually quite hard to get something out of an ebook, I've found in the last couple of years. So again, I think you want to just figure out what you have access to and then talk to your librarian. So I'm going to skip ahead a few and ask you some questions. So these are entirely hypothetical, but I just wanted to ask you a couple case study questions. So you're interested in text analysis, a text analysis project on medieval Spanish novels. Oh yeah, and also I have my text. Can I meet with you? And so what kinds of questions would you ask this person? What kinds of problems might you expect based on the kinds of material and resources that we talked about so far?
Well, number one would be in what status are these texts? What is the condition of the text? If they're medieval, are they parchments rather than any other sort of material? Are they bound, or not? And are they legible? The other question is the language itself. Medieval Spanish is not at all like present time Spanish. So,
yeah, very good. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm hoping to do with you all is you can go out and you can spread the good news about how the format matters and your accessibility to those materials matters a lot. So how about the second one? I want to study the concept of the family as discussed in online forums for Mexican American communities. Can we meet to discuss? So what kinds of questions or problems would you sort of foresee for this person? And I'm kind of putting you in the shoes, I'm casting you in the shoes of like the librarian, digital humanities librarian doing a consult here.
Yep. So we have some questions in the chat.
Oh, good.
In what
Sorry.
form are your in what form are your texts? Ethics of taking the content from the web. What materials do you have, such as letters, photos, journals?
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, exactly right. So they are technically, depending on this fictional example, they might be in formats that are very usable. They might be text already. Gathering those materials is a separate question. It's a separate workshop. But I think the ethical question that was pointed out in the chat is also a really good one. And it's a really complicated one. But it's one to keep in mind, like whether or not you would even need to potentially go through like your institutional review board to gather those kinds of materials. But also, I've found that institutional review boards are kind of more about covering the universities behind and legal questions and not so much about the actual ethics of things. So I think it's just good to keep in mind who is the community you're working with? What is your connection to them? What rights do you have to tell their story? And yeah, so I'm going to keep moving just because I want to make sure we get through some stuff. But just to summarize what I think you all have already articulated, has anyone made these texts available before? Do I have access to them? If I do, are they in the format I need? Can I convert them into the format I need? Am I allowed to do this with the texts that I have? I think are all really important questions to have before you even get to the point of trying to think about how you actually work with the analytical side of your texts. So I'm going to do that thing that I did before where I ask you an abstract question and I imagine the look that my neuroscience and psychology students would have on their faces. So what are computers good at? We taught a lot about electronics and books. Yeah, computers, sorry.
Process information, huge amount of information in a second.
Yeah, good. I see some stuff in the chat. Recognizing patterns, number operations, presenting information. Yeah, any other thoughts?
The external memory too.
Story memory.
External memory.
External memory.
Yes, very, very good. And I think that's cover most of the bullet points I had, which is they're very good at counting, following logic, storing information, sharing information, speed, processing data. Yeah, very good. And so we asked before, what is a book? So originally I had, what are books good at? But I think in this case, it maybe the better analogy might be, what are readers good at? Which is a slightly different question, but yeah, what are readers good at? Interpreting based on context, very good. Reading between the lines, very good. What else?
Analyzing tone, analyzing like smaller amounts of data.
Yeah, sort of deep work on small amounts, connecting things, very good.
Retrieval up until a certain point.
Yes, retrieval up until a certain point. And that Virginia Woolf project actually started because I was manually taking notes on instances of dialogue and the different kinds of dialogue. And when I got to like 100, it's like, I have to stop this and use a computer. And so I think these are all kinds of things that people have brought out. They're good at inferring, they're good at imagining things, they're good at escaping, projecting, remembering, drawing kinds of connections to other things that people have read. But I think in the context of text analysis and how we get from a book to the graph that we want at the end, I think it's really important to keep in mind the disconnect between what computers are good at and what readers are good at, and how if we're trying to get the computer to do the kind of reading that we're interested in, we have to kind of think differently, which is to say, we've already talked about computers don't know what they're looking at. They're not necessarily good at nuance. They can't infer. And I'm sort of putting aside all artificial intelligence and large language models because I'm about as hardcore of an AI skeptic as you can imagine. But there's lots of interesting work that people are doing on those kinds of tools. But this is sort of a different kind of way of thinking about text analysis. It's a little more basic, I think. But at its core, I think what we need to do is think about how we can take the concrete, measurable stuff in a computer, the stuff that is objective, and connect that to the stuff that we as readers are really interested in, which is to say that the stuff that they are good at is stuff that we're bad at, and the stuff that they're bad at is stuff that we're good at. And so it's sort of a matter of trying to bridge the disconnect and the gap between those two things. And so what I think we need to do in general is, and this is often what someone will come to me with a particular kinds of complex humanities research question, and it's always really interesting. And what I have to do is try and help them figure out how to measure it in something as something concrete. So the question that came up a second ago, you have a Virginia Woolf novel. What if you're interested in smaller subsections of it? And I said, well, what is the concrete thing I can tell my computer to grab onto to then divide up that text? Another example might be, I had a student who was working on ancient Hebrew or novels, and she was interested in a particular angel in them. She was a religious studies PhD student, and she wanted to find all the instances in which this angel was discussed. So normally I would say, okay, cool, we'll do a word search for that person's name. And she said, oh, also they're never named. You just sort of know they're in the room. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? How do I tell a computer to look at that? And we had to take her humanities research question and come up with a model for thinking to try, like, what does it look like to describe that for a computer? And what we wound up doing was something called essentially like a really big keyword in context, where we would say, we look for a mention of the name, and then we grab like 5 paragraphs on each side of that name, with the understanding that, like, even if the angel is not mentioned in a passage 3 pages from now, they might still be in the room to some degree. And then we can sort of work back and forth between the different large scale and close scale, if that makes sense. So that's just to say, I think it's an art, and it takes a lot of practice, but I think it's probably the most demonstrably useful thing you can do is to try and think about how to take something abstract and make it concrete, and take something concrete and make it abstract. So what I wanted to do now is just practice for a second. And this is where you all are my guinea pigs, because I've never tried this before, though I did try it with my wife. So you should be able to annotate the Zoom screen, I think. On my screen, if you look in the bottom left, you can see an annotate button. And if you click on that, you should be able to draw on the screen. Are people seeing this? Yeah, I see Gabby doing it. So what I want to do, this is a version of an exercise that the University of Michigan does when they teach TEI. They say, I want you to draw squares around particular structural elements, and then we'll sort of extrapolate from those squares to what the different elements that we want to model in TEI are. So what I want you to do is draw boxes, or otherwise annotate the poem to the right, Langston Hughes. I was a modernist. I wrote about Hughes for my dissertation. And I want you to annotate that poem with like the different elements that a computer might be interested in, or that the different elements that you could point a computer to, and then develop research questions from it. Yeah, good. So this is to some degree an exercise in how to take the concrete stuff on the page and make it connected to more interesting humanities research questions that we care about. And this is great. I'm glad this is working. I'm like doing it live. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about what they annotated? I'm delighted with all of this. Or have I created the problem where like you give people colored pencils and then they stop talking because like they're interested in just drawing?
The spacing and the way it looks, so the indentations, I think that's been marked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so interestingly, the indentations, and I have some resources I can share on this, often are thrown away. The white space is often thrown away when you're doing text analysis. But if you're a poet, poetry person, you really care about those things, and there are ways to introduce them back in. And it's a complication, but yeah, you could totally try and point to those. Yeah, what else? What else that people circled? Adjectives, good. Verbs, good. What else? I see word counts and line counts. And so you can sort of imagine a world in which you tell a counting room or something computers are good at. You get the whole text in. You could ask it to count how many words there are. You could ask it to count how many lines there are. I see someone circled the first couple lines. Does anyone want to say something about that?
Oh, sorry, that was me.
Yeah.
So the computer would be able to determine the title and the author. Uh, whether the computer has information stored about the author, that's a different matter, but it can recognize that,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah. And so I think in this, as with all things, it often depends. But in this case, I think what I would do is if you just have scans of like 10,000 poems, right? You have the text of 10,000 poems. Let's assume the text is really good. You can use the word by in this case. If you know that all of your poems have by and then the author name, you could tell your computer to grab onto that and say, okay, look for the word by and then 2 line breaks, and the names that come after that, that's going to be the author. And similarly, you could look for like 3 line breaks followed by the word by, and that will give you the title. But again, notice that like the computer doesn't know what a title is, it doesn't know what an author is until you sort of point to a particular path to thinking about those. And people are pointing out lots of really cool stuff and interesting stuff in the chat. And I think some of them are, it's a mix of like concrete stuff that you can point to, like question marks, capitalization, and then also some more complicated stuff. And I think in general, this kind of trying to convert abstract to complicated and complicated to abstract is a really important skill. Okay, and so the one thing I didn't think about was how to get rid of all those. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then screen share again, which I think should get rid of them. All right, cool. But I do kind of love the idea of your annotations just going rogue and like existing for the rest of the talk. But so in general, here are some examples of concrete, measurable stuff that I think often are things you can point to. Like, what is the case? Is something capitalized or not? I worked with a student who was interested in Tumblr posts, and she was saying she was really interested in when people talked in all capitals and that sort of thing. What are the different words? What's the vocabulary separate from like all the different words in sequence? What are the structural elements? And then the caveat there is already brought up, which is to say, how can you identify structural elements based on what's on the page, whether they're line breaks or the word chapter and then a number, stuff like that. And then the other kinds of stuff that come up are, besides the metadata, which we talked about how often has to be added manually, would be things like proximity, like which words are near each other, whether that's in a single sentence, whether that's in a paragraph, whether that's in a document as a whole. And how we define document matters a lot in this context. That could be like a chapter or a page or a novel or a poem. The order the words come in is often very important. And then your $10 word that you can use at cocktail parties is syntagmatic axis, which just means like the sequence of stuff in order, which is to say, you can have a sentence, and if that sentence is in order, it has a syntagmatic axis. And if you scramble up the words and you still have the words, but you don't have the original order, you've gotten rid of the syntagmatic axis. So just important to keep those in mind. And so as a way of trying to build towards the same exercise that we did before, where I said, what would you say to someone who came in with a particular kind of question? I wanted to introduce a kind of test that you can ask of text analysis research question. And this is also a nod to the thing that I think I get asked to talk about more than anything else, way more than text analysis. I get asked to give workshops and talks with grad students on imposter syndrome, which is to say this concern that you don't know enough to do what you're doing, that somebody is going to come into the Zoom room and say, aha, you right there, you're an imposter and you need to leave. The comment on the comic on the right is from XKCD, and it's like a joking riff on this. But I think you all have it in you to do this work. You all have already shown that you have a really good sense of what kinds of questions can be asked. And so I've sort of jokingly said that the thing that makes a good text analysis research question is me, M period, E period, which is to say you. You just can always say that to yourself, like you have what it takes. What you need for a research question is me. But I actually have me as standing for something very specific here, which is the two things we talked about. A good text analysis research question comes from having materials that are appropriate for what you want to look at and that are accessible to you in all the ways we talked about. And then it comes from having evidence that is identifiable and measurable to the computer in some sense. So you both belong here, and you have all the tools you need to be able to be a DH librarian like I am and give people a consult. And so what I wanted to do was go through a couple more case studies before we turn to Voyant and just ask you to apply these kinds of questions to it. So let us say, I am interested in which Shakespeare character is the most important in Romeo and Juliet. How would you approach this kind of a question, this kind of a consultation for someone who's coming in to talk to you, specifically with reference to the materials and the evidence tests? Define important, good. Yes, number of lines in the play. So maybe like then, do you want to say more about that before I answer my own question?
Sure. So basically, I mean, the title of the play sort of gives it away that it's going to be either Romeo or Juliet, but you can look at the text and determine the number of lines that each character has, and the more lines and the more parliaments, the more important to the play it is. It's very simple, and it doesn't infer meaning or hermeneutical interpretation. It's just numbers.
Yeah, totally. But I think what you're pointing to, though, is that you have developed a theory of what importance means. To answer the first comment, you have developed a sense of evidence that is both identifiable and legible for what you're looking at. Like you can look at the character name, figure out how many lines they have, and then start to get at the larger research question. So I'm going to go to the next one. I'm interested in how space and place are represented in literature of the Southeastern United States. So how would you approach this one? Literature review, good. Can we narrow the corpus down? Absolutely. That's a really great one. I think, when in doubt, always ask them to scope down. It's always good with humanities people. So those are both about the materials. Does anyone have an idea of how you might approach the evidence side of things? Also, Lorena, you're muted for what it's worth. I can see people talking in the room, but good.
Or I'll tell them they can, we have a mic so they can answer.
Cool. Gotcha. Good. But so people in the...
I think we do have a question.
I was going to say it in English. The thing is that to measure or to identify how important a character is, it's also relevant how many times the rest of the characters allude to him or her, and how they shape their actions based on that character's will or presence. So, but I don't know how can you measure that in numbers? Because sometimes it would be, how do you say, tacito, like it's only mentioned by him or her, or even like without the name.
Implied.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that goes back to the how do you define important question. And I think similarly with this case study, there's an element of like, how do you define space? How do you define place? And like, in order to try and address those questions, you're kind of developing a theory of space and place to try and come up with some approach to them. My general here, I'm going to skip ahead to my second to last slide and come back. But I really like this quote. What should you do with your results? Often it's a detail seen from afar that motivates a closer look. And so I like that because to me, I'm very uninterested in, for the most part, in like what you get out of a corpus from these kinds of methods. in general, like as a graph. And I am almost always, so I'm very rarely interested in like what an answer is to one of these questions. And I'm almost always more interested in how they start to make you think differently about the text, which is to say, I think your point, which is like, you have a particular way of thinking about what importance is in a play, and then you maybe try and look at it using these kinds of concrete measurable methods, and maybe it comes out looking strange, but like that gives you a thing to talk against. That doesn't show that your analysis is an error, if that makes sense. It just sort of offers you more grist for your mill, more to think about. And I think similarly, the people who have been answering this question about how space and place are defined are showing that the concrete things that one way you could approach this kind of concrete question would be to say, okay, space and place is going to be, we're going to start out just looking at what kinds of places are talked about, which is to say we're going to look for particular words associated with space and place. And so this is where I just sort of nod to the fact that there are lots of different methods that people use that are very complicated, that have different kinds of complex things they can do for your text, but they're kind of built out of a lot of these small measurable things that we've been talking about. So if you're talking about comparing many different documents, looking at how different or similar they are, you're talking about word counting at the end of the day, topic modeling, which is about broad thematic things in your text. It's looking at word proximity. And then similarly, let me go to the identifying named places and named spaces. That's a thing called named entity recognition that at the end of the day is working on a very complicated way to try to identify specific measurable elements. So we could go much more in depth about any one of these things, but this is just by way of saying that I think if you can understand at its core that you're trying to find evidence, you're trying to take the concrete evidence of the text and connect it to broader abstract research questions and ideas, I think that's going to really get you pretty far in terms of understanding how a lot of these methods work, including complicated things like artificial intelligence and large language models. Like those are, at the end of the day, broken down in these same kind of forms, all of which is to say, none of this is beyond you, and you all have what it takes. So I'm also just keeping an eye on the time, and my alarm went off. So I wanted to move in the last little bit to Voyant, which is the graph portion. So we have talked about how to get your materials, and then we talked about how to think about them in ways that can help to answer research questions and ask research questions. And I often turn to Voyant, which is a browser-based tool, to give people a chance to play with text analysis and play with text analysis questions in a way that doesn't require programming and that is free, in part because I don't know what kind of technical background people in the room have. I never know what my students have on their computers. Some of them might not have laptops. Like, how do you navigate all these kinds of teaching challenges? And Voyant is a good space in which to start working with them. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close my PowerPoint, and I'm going to just continue screen sharing my browser as we play with Voyant a little bit in the last little bit. So the first thing you want to do is go to this website, voyant-tools.org. So it's a very powerful tool. It exists in the browser. It can do an awful lot for you. But I wanted to just sort of talk you through a couple different things about it. I'm going to let you play for a second, and I'm going to talk about more complicated things that you can do with it. So because I know there are lots of different folks here interested in non-English language, I wanted to show you that this is the front page, and what you're going to do is upload a text here in a second. But in general, Voyant, I think, tries to be really well designed and aesthetically pleasing in some ways, to the detriment of its usability. But you can get access to language interface options if you hover over this button here, and you can get different options. So if you wanted to look at the interface in Spanish, you have access to that. It's also going to, so that should change, I think, the interface, but I believe also that if you upload a Spanish text or a text in a different language, it's going to auto detect what that language is. So as long as you're working from a left to right and not a right to left language, it's likely going to work for our purposes. But I just wanted to show you a couple things before I let you go play. And so I'm going to put this in the chat. So what I did was I asked, oh, it says I'm unable to send a file. Let me see if I can. Okay. So if you go to that bit.ly link, you should have access to a Voyant Tools interface. And so if I go to it, I should see, yeah. So what I did was I asked Lorena for a text relevant to you all, usLdh text that I could put into Voyant just to give you something that was relevant to you all to play with. And so she sent me this text, which is La Patria Perdida. Lorena, did you want to say in a couple sentences about what this is? Because I think this is the first one that you sent me.
Sure. This is a novel, an immigration novel that was published or serialized in La Prensa de San Antonio, a newspaper, and then republished as a novel. And so you can find that on our APP digital page. Is there something else you?
No, that's great. Thriving, doing great. So Lorena sent me this link to the text, and I just wanted to show you what happened when I first tried to upload it. So I clicked here. I clicked here. I found the text and I thought, great, this text is all on one page. Voyant is really handy in that it can, you can either point it to a link, a series of links, or you can upload a text as an Excel spreadsheet, which is really confusing. And I have instructions for how to do that in the PowerPoint. But so the first thing I tried, just because I think it's useful to know, is I tried just pasting the link in here. And it's gonna take a second, it's gonna spin. And for what it's worth, this is one of the disadvantages to working with it in the browser, which is to say it can really like not do great with super long texts. But what do you make of these results? This is the full text it's looking at here. What do we think happened? Like what happened to the text that we were interested in? Yes, the website metadata is really not great, so it's pulling from that instead. I think that's really close. So what happened was it went to this website and there's some like JavaScript or something parsing behind the scenes to make the text appear. And that interfered with the way that Voyant was trying to pull the text in. And it actually didn't get the text at all. It just got like the skeleton of what a manifold page looks like. And so I thought, okay, that didn't work. So instead, what I did was I selected the text entirely. And I went back to the empty box here and I just pasted it in. And then that's what got us to this thing, this link that I sent you. So that's just something that's, I think, helpful to know, which is that like you have to be critical about what you're looking at and be critical about what the tools seem to be telling you, because there's all sorts of technical things that might be going on. But in terms of how Voyant works, there are a few things I wanted to point out if you've never looked at it before. By default, when you enter a Voyant instance, when you've uploaded a text, it's going to dump you into this view, which can immediately be confusing because it feels like there is so much going on. But I wanted to just point out a few things. The way Voyant is arranged is in these little panes, these little windows, each of which corresponds to a particular kind of tool or analysis. So like up here, it's giving us a word cloud of most common words. This reader pane in the middle is actually the like full text of the document, I think. This pane over here is word usage over time. In the bottom right here, context is showing us, I called it keyword in context or quick a little while ago, but it's a single word and then the phrases or words on either side of it. And then over here, you have a summary of lots of different documents. So a few things that you should know about, they're all linked. So if you go to this reader interface and you click on a particular word, like patria, it'll update all this stuff. So now down here, we're not looking at instead we're looking at that particular word, and we're seeing the word usage over time. So like you can sort of click through and pick the word that you're interested in, and they're all related. And the question in the chat about can the word cloud be arranged differently is an excellent one. And that, again, it's like you're a plant. To modify any of these tools, the other thing that is important to know is that if you hover over this question mark, it gives you a few options. The little 4 squares in a row actually give you access to way more tools. So if you were overwhelmed at first already, don't look at this page because it's going to be way more than you can ever hope to use. But there are lots and lots of other tools that aren't there. But to the question I just got, this little slider button will show you the options for a particular tool. And you can see by default, it's auto-detecting the kinds of words that it's going to ignore. So by default, it's got a list of stop words or words that are most common in any language that it's going to get rid of and ignore. And it looks like you can't edit the vertical text, though we could try to change some of this. So that changed just like the font style and I think the color palette. But every tool that you're looking at is going to have some options like that. So just to review the stuff I was just talking about, these are kind of the first most important things about working with Voyant. It's all in cells. Everything is connected together. You hover over the question mark to get to a slider or to get to different options for tools that you might not already have. And what I wanted you to do now is just play with it for 5 minutes before I go on to more complicated functions, such that you have a chance to like get your hands in it. And just I'll set my alarm and then shout out questions as you have them, and we can sort of discuss while people are continuing to play. Does that make sense? Cool. So I got my alarm going. Let me know if you have things you want to talk about while you're playing. But otherwise, play with the text a little bit. Try and see what seems confusing or what interesting things you can do with it. Yeah, so since Gabby asks, can you add more than one file at a time? That is the next piece that I was going to talk about. And I think that's almost one of the last pieces. So I'll maybe wait a couple minutes and then address that. You can download the information. So I think that is a really important note, which is to say, for any one of these tools, there's an export option here. What I did was I just grabbed the whole URL, but I think you can actually export like this particular series of panes or any one of these windows and embed it in a browser, in a blog post, or take a screenshot and that sort of thing. But they definitely are trying to imagine it as being used in publications, that sort of thing. In their book, Hermeneutica, Stefan Sinclair and Jeffrey Rockwell, they're the ones who are behind the tool, and they just use Voyant visualizations all throughout it as a way to try and illustrate what you can do with it. Yeah, and I'll come back to your question in a second, Gabby.
Brenda, can you say the name of the book again, please? Of the title?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can probably just, because I'm screen sharing, put it in the chat. I spelled it wrong. Yeah, it's this one. And, you know, I wasn't there when they wrote it, but to me, it has the vibe of having written, it has the vibe to me of like kind of a, before there was like a way to really reliably peer review digital projects, like develop a text such that Voyant was legible for tenure and promotion portfolios, because it's a text that's very much just like justifying the existence of the tool and what you can do with it. If that makes sense. Yeah, can you put words into groups and measure how often each group appears? That is a really good question. And yes, you can. So the question is, can you put words into groups and measure how often each group appears? What you're describing is something called a collocate, a collocation. And what that refers to is, see, this is, the more you start to do this immediately, I'm like, I should have just gotten a degree in linguistics because I'm always worried I'm going to use the wrong terms. But essentially what you're talking about is is going to be referred to as a collocate or an n-gram, like a gram being a series of words, and n being the length of how long that word is. So like a bigram is a 2-word phrase, a trigram is a 3-word phrase. But if you click this collocate button, it should give you access to that kind of a thing. So you can see here, patria perdida occurs 53 words. Can you put words into group measure? Group interesting. So yeah, so you're talking there more about like topics and themes as opposed to like direct phrases. Let me see if I believe that's possible. But let me check. I think that this is a version of what you're describing. So I believe that is possible. For what it's worth, the documentation for Voyant is enormous, and I think of mixed utility, as I'll discuss in just the last few moments here. But I think what I would do is take a look at the topics documentation here, because I think that's what you're describing. There's definitely a way to do that with, if you were to do a like a more nuanced analysis of the text using like Python or something like that, which is usually what I tell students is the trade-off in using a free tool like this is you're kind of limited by what they give you, and you have to figure out how to use what they give you. So I think that this topics view, which is kind of approximating something like topic modeling, is probably what you have in mind, but there are other kinds of ways to do it as well. So in the last few minutes, I wanted to just point out a couple things about Voyant before we stop. So a couple things. It's quick to use, no programming at all. It can do a lot. Also, the fact that it can do a lot is not great because the documentation is a little limited. And I have found that if you put a super long text in it, or you put a ton of different text, sometimes it'll just fall over. You can run it locally on your computer. Like you can download Voyant as a piece of software and run it, which might work in some instances. But just be aware of the limitations that you're working with. And I think what Gabby pointed out is a first, it's like, I think a very understandable impulse to try and want to look at more than one text at a time. And also I think is where Voyant starts to have a little bit of trouble. So in that first window, this upload interface, you can actually give it multiple links and give it multiple, it'll treat each of those as individual files. And then each of those individual files will be hooked into the interface here. So this corpus only has one file in it. And so what it did was, instead of looking at many different documents, it divided that document into 10 equal parts. But let me see. Let me grab another link for you to show you what it looks like. So I'm not going to have a link for you, but what it would look like is, rather than showing the documents over time, each one of these would correspond to a particular document, which actually starts to get very messy very quickly because Voyant isn't great about working with metadata. So I wanted to show you, I think, the most confusing piece of this, and then I'll sort of stop and hopefully give a couple minutes for questions. But if you take anything away from this workshop, I think this is maybe going to be the most helpful, which is instructions for how to upload an Excel spreadsheet to Voyant, because this is the best way that I have found for working with a corpus of materials. So what you do is you actually have a single Excel file that have, is there a specific way to differentiate specific documents? Copy and paste the text from the site into the field. I think this is going to address that question for what it's worth. So you set up your Excel spreadsheet such that you actually have the texts of your documents in the Excel spreadsheet. So like we have a file name here in column A, the author is in column B, the date in column C, keyword in column D, etc. But then the text, column G, actually is a full text document. And if you've ever worked with Excel, it can be kind of a huge pain to make it do that. It might try to insert extra line breaks and cells and stuff, and you might have to play with it a little bit. But what you wind up getting, like this is a document that has, I think, 12, or an Excel sheet corpus that has 12 files in it. You'll have 12 rows. And what you do to upload an Excel spreadsheet to Voyant, I think, is really not well documented in the documentation, but I'll just show you what it looks like real quick. You click options here, and under options, there's a tables button, because technically an Excel spreadsheet is a table. And what you're going to do is start specifying what columns correspond to which piece of your Excel spreadsheet, using the numbers 1 instead of column A, 2 instead of column B. So like what we would do here is say, specify which column numbers correspond to your content. That would be, according to the spreadsheet I have here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm going through and I'm actually mapping column letters onto column numbers. And then when you upload it, it will differentiate all those different texts, and you'll get a nice Voyant interface view that will show you all the different things. So like for author, for each text, again, authors in column B, so it's 1, 2, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's useful to know how to do this, but I also wanted to point out that it doesn't really work well with the metadata that you upload. So let me show you what this looks like here. Without actually going through the process of uploading it, what you get is a series of documents here, each of which correspond to the different rows of your Excel spreadsheet, which you would think, oh, I can do interesting things with this. I can like subdivide my corpus by publisher and like look at particular documents for particular locations and particular communities. But in fact, Voyant isn't set up well to do that at all. The most you can do is like generate a new corpus based on those metadata categories. It won't actually allow you to do any analysis within there. So that's all by way of like just very briefly hand waving at the kind of stuff that you could do and the kind of stuff that is complicated. I think the instructions in the PowerPoint should hopefully give you what you need if you wanted to try and do that on your own, but you're also welcome to reach out to me because I found it really painful to try and troubleshoot through that. And also not especially useful once you actually get it in. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and I know it's 12:25, so I want to pause and just, make space for any other questions that people might have. Yeah, okay, the last couple chats were just saying thanks, but yeah. So that is a very, very, very brief introduction to all that. Hopefully that will give you enough to get started with Voyant and such, but yeah.
So are there any questions?
I'm gonna turn
Again,
off
you can unmute yourself.
I'm gonna turn off the recording so that people can ask questions in